Hi, welcome to the Sunday mornings at the Marxist Library. A reminder before we start, we are recording our presentations and the discussions that follow and post these for our wider audience. The videos will be available both at our YouTube channel, ICSS Marxist, and our website, icssmarx.org, in the next couple of days. As the ICSS group, which stands for the Institute for the Critical Study of Society, we are a group of volunteers who organize the meetings and a larger group of participants who meet every Sunday to discuss the world matters, politics, economics, environmental issues, peoples and workers' movements, imperialism, neocolonialism, history, classes, and class struggles, impacting the world and human societies around the world. Before the pandemic, we used to meet at the Niebel Proctor Marxist Library located at 6501 Telegraph Avenue, Oakland, California. However, after the pandemic, we decided to continue our sessions on Zoom, which also made us open up to the world online real time. We are planning on resuming our physical meetings again at the Niebel Proctor Library while continuing our Zoom sessions as well, hopefully soon. We will keep you updated on this process as we get prepared for the hybrid meetings. So as well as our local participants and speakers from the San Francisco Bay Area, we now have guests and speakers from all over the US and from other countries as well. They endure the time difference to join us, so welcome again and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and even good night to you wherever you may be joining us right now. My name is Mehmet Bayram, and I will be hosting this session on Sunday, May 15th, 2022. I'm a member of the program committee that organizes the Sunday mornings at the Marxist Library, and I'd like to start off by reminding everybody that we always welcome your input, feedback, and suggestions for topics and speakers. You can contact us through our website at icssmarx.org. For over 15 years, Sunday mornings at the Marxist Library programs have been a platform for diverse presentations on a variety of topics. This meeting is a comradely forum for political discourse and debate. The opinions expressed here are those of the participants, and they do not necessarily represent those of ICSS or the Marxist Library. However, we are united in our respect for the work of Karl Marx, and we believe that his work remains relevant today. Our motto is taken from Karl Marx's 11th thesis on Feuerbach. Quote, "The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it." Today's session is titled China and Completing Humanity's Transition from Capitalism to Socialism. I'd like to give the floor to Yusuf Yursey, a close friend of Wadi'h's, to introduce him, after which I will further introduce the speaker and the topic. Yusuf, maybe I can, if you can unmute yourself for a brief time.
Yes, thank you for Sunday morning at the Marxist Library for enabling me to introduce my dear friend and comrade, Wadi'h Halabi, who has been so for 50 years. I first met him and his wife, Sandy, distributing a leaflet on the occasion of a screening of the Battle of Algiers. I immediately participated, and this was my first political action. Wadi'h Halabi was born in Jaffa, Palestine, before the Nakba, in other words, the catastrophe. That is May 15th, 1948, the beginning of the ongoing ethnic cleansing. We remember this very day. He is a member of the Economics Commission of the CPUSA and the Peace and Solidarity Commission of the CPUSA, and a founder of the Center for Marxist Education in Boston, which is a similar outfit to this. A more detailed background will shed light on this presentation, which is prepared by the speaker, and this will follow.
So the introduction I'd like to give on the topic and the speaker is that in the spring of 2000, leaders in China first invited our speaker today, Wadi'h Halabi, who is the Communist Party and the Center for Marxist Education. The invitation asked him to expand on an economics column published in the People's World. The article column had refuted bourgeois economists' explanation for the relative stability of US GDP at the time during the so-called dot-com boom. In the initial visit, our speaker made a proposal to China's leaders on behalf of the CPUSA. It was followed by the gradual reintegration of the Communist Party of China into Solidnet, which groups the official communist parties worldwide. Solidnet hosts the annual international meeting of communist and workers' parties. Together, the 118 member parties currently have more than 110 million members worldwide. In addition, these parties have 420 million workers in their affiliated unions, enough to drown the capitalists when we learn to spit together. The Chinese party's return followed their 40-year absence. 4 years later, the speaker made a second proposal to China's leaders. It was a call to challenge Walmart management, which was violating labor laws even in China and playing a major role in weakening and cheapening labor worldwide. An 18-month-long discussion followed within the Chinese Communist Party. The state cabinet ultimately decided positively in favor of the proposal. That led to the historic unionizing of all Walmart workers in China. The first 17 stores were organized from below, using secret meetings, midnight meetings, before Walmart management caved in. The remaining stores were unionized by agreement from above. Dozens of invitations have followed in the past 2 decades. The focus has been on changes in the world political economy and especially on identifying and addressing the weaknesses that ultimately led to the fall of the Soviet Union and other severe defeats, including defeats of what should have been socialist revolutions, for example, in Lebanon in 1976 and Iran in 1979. The speaker was born in Palestine. His presentation draws from what he calls class lessons of Palestine. In 1948, he was driven out of Palestine as a young child in the ethnic cleansing required to create the Israeli apartheid state. He subsequently lived in Gaza, then Egypt, then Lebanon, all in times of war or civil war. One lesson: the world is changeable, either way. The speaker also studies the material basis for revolutionary optimism. Thank you, Wadi'h, welcome, and I'll give the floor to you now. Thank you.
Oh, Mehmet, thank you so much, and really thank you to ICSS, and congratulations for maintaining such a consistent schedule through the pandemic, and for the spirit of debate and respect that you've engendered, and the attention to organizational details. So, and for me, the participation of the Communist Party in this work is important. I should mention, as I have in previous presentations, that Gene Royal's definitely not a concession speech from his run a decade ago. I find it a model for Marxist electoral work, and it deserves wide publicity and regular republication. So, and really special thanks also to Al Sargis for his extraordinary, tireless work in locating and disseminating materials that can give us a nuanced picture of what's happening, for example, in China, or with this ugly war in Ukraine, and much more. And also to Gary Hicks for his great historical depth and direction. And really to my wife and comrade Sandy for keeping me going. So what is China today? Is it capitalist? Is it socialist? Is it something else? Was the Chinese Revolution of 1949 a bourgeois democratic revolution, peasant revolution, or proletarian revolution? What about the Communist Party of China? Does it represent a gain or an obstacle to humanity's transition from capitalism to socialism? What about China's unions? They're not particularly effective. What are they? So what is the nature of capitalism antagonism towards China, which, as we know, has escalated immensely in the past since the Obama years, but it had never disappeared. What led Soviet leaders to expel Yugoslavia from the world communist movement not long after its great revolution? What led to the grievous Sino-Soviet rift, which played such a role in the fall of the Soviet Union and other defeats? But then what was behind Communist Party leaders in China denouncing the Soviet Union as imperialist, social imperialist to be exact? What was behind China's leaders hailing, welcoming the Pinochet-led coup in Chile, or supporting imperialist forces in Africa, for example? Moving on a little bit, decades ago, Marxists often said the future of humanity would be written in the United States. Why can we say today that the future of humanity would be written in China? Why do I believe that China's unions, women's federations, and other basic organizations should each have a formal voice with their own experts, along with the government and the party, in developing pandemic policy? So, considering all the wars, the social and environmental destruction, is there a material basis for revolutionary optimism? What is it? I'm not going to try to cover all these questions in the presentation. I'm hoping that the methodology and the discussion can help address them. So if we look at the writings, the educational materials, and the actual practice of the Communist Party of China in the 28 years from when it was founded, 1921, to the victory of the revolution, 1949, there's no doubt that its impulse came from the Russian Revolution, the Great October Socialist Revolution, and that it was guided by Marxism and continues to look to Marxism for direction. So what is Marxism? It's the only philosophy that's consistent with the interests of the working class. So the class requires alliances with other oppressed classes, above all the peasantry in China's case, in a common struggle to overthrow capitalism. But the guiding philosophy of the party was Marxism, not bourgeois liberalism, nor a peasant outlook. In the revolutionary struggle, the Chinese party and the Red Army's attention to even the smallest, most complicated national questions, land reform tasks, language tasks, the struggle against patriarchy, there's something extraordinary about the attention to detail that you see there. And it really built on lessons from the Russian revolutions and subsequent struggles. So, but while, say, struggling against patriarchy or against national oppression, the party consistently, patiently taught the primacy of a struggle against the power of the exploiters, that the enemy is not, say, a neighboring national minority, it's the power of the exploiters. So placing, developing that focus on the power of the exploiters. Again, something just remarkable. I keep asking my hosts for a book, a short book, to describe this practice, which would actually be good for China too, and to publish it in 200 languages, please. But if there is a good book about these various practices, I don't know of one. And I've asked Al Sargis if anybody would know, it would be him. I don't know if he knows that. So again, both the party and the Red Army in China were unmistakably guided by Marxism. The Red Army and the masses decisively smashed the bodies of armed men of the exploiters, of Chiang Kai-shek, forcing him to flee. So this struggle explodes at the end of 1945, and the victory is decisive. It finally got support from the Soviet Union, and one of the great events in all of human history takes place then, end of September, when a new class comes to power. So, and to give one example of guidance from Marxism, you can look at practically any major work of the Chinese party, but give an example, Mao's 1940 work on new democracy. It refers to the world revolution, specifically the world proletarian socialist revolution, at least a dozen times, and repudiates bourgeois revolution. It explains why bourgeois revolution cannot come to China. And my primary guide in today's presentation, and in so much of what I try to do, including in China, is Lenin's State and Revolution. As far as I'm concerned, it's the single most important work of Lenin for this period. All of her work is phenomenal, but State and Revolution. And I want to emphasize Lenin asserts, following Marx and Engels, that to be a Marxist requires extending our Marxism to recognition of the dictatorship of a proletariat. As Norma has said in one discussion or another, the decisive question is that of working class power. And note that Marx and Engels and Lenin did not call, say, for the dictatorship of a proletariat and peasantry. Why? Weren't they aware that the peasants formed the overwhelming majority of the world's oppressed? Of course they were. National liberation and land reform is a crucial task of the workers' alliance with other oppressed classes, above all the peasants. But having achieved that, it's necessary to liberate the property-attached classes, including the urban petty bourgeoisie, but also the peasantry, from enslavement to property. And any theory or practice that dilutes dictatorship of a proletariat is a recipe for problems. And this has been a problem in China. There wasn't sufficient clarity. But nevertheless, again, the point of reference is the Russian Revolution. The point of reference is the work of Marx and Engels and Lenin on this. So allowing us to correct confusion on this. But, you know, this maybe in discussion, we can go into why this is potentially problematic now with the pressures that have developed possibly explosively with the pandemic and the lockdowns in several cities and entire provinces. Okay. Now, unquestionably, there have been huge changes in China. Above all, there's been an incredible decline in poverty. It's wrong, in my opinion, to say complete wiping out of extreme poverty. It's possible the pandemic has brought some back, but the decline in poverty is extraordinary. Nobody has achieved anything like this. Compare it with the growth in extreme poverty in all capitalist countries, not just across, say, South Asia or much of Africa, but in the United States. Extreme poverty by World Bank standards climbed 150% in the 15 years to 2011, and almost certainly has exploded since the pandemic. So extreme poverty, $2 a day in the United States. And other changes in China is unbelievable economic and cultural development, a huge growth in the number of proletarians, but also a large growth in the rank of exploiters, business owners, and self-employed, and major domestic and international capitalist inroads into China. Despite this, there's an unmistakable continuity in the state created in 1949 to today. Just there was an unmistakable continuity in the state, in the Soviet state from 1917 to 1991, and then huge discontinuity after 1991. And well, we're seeing some of a byproduct of it with the war now, but what's happened since 1991, in the states that fell to counter-revolution, not just the Soviet states, but the Yugoslavias and the Czechoslovakias and so on, something extraordinary happened. So we now have capitalist states formed by counter-revolution. So, so this is then a decisive consideration in assessing the class nature of a state, not say what proportion of production is controlled by the state. To give you an example, and again, this is one of the problems we face with the Communist Party of the Russian Federation. Several years ago, a member of that Communist Party, which has generally tailed Putin, proudly told me that the Russian state today controls a larger share of GDP than does the Chinese state. But that doesn't make the Russian Federation socialist or proletarian. It's what class holds power that's decisive. Still, we cannot ignore the changes in China that could or do weaken the power, strength, and consciousness of the working class. And by working class, I don't mean just the Chinese working class, I mean internationally. So one of the requests I've made, which was seriously considered, nothing much has happened. There are efforts, but one of the requests I made is to my hosts is, would you please consider opening an international university of Marxism? Maybe starting with just a summer school, and again was seriously considered. They've taken other approaches because apparently they got resistance on developing such a school. But nevertheless, it's not just the consciousness of the Chinese working class; it's that of a world working class. The counter-revolutions that brought down the Soviet Union and 11 other states in the late 1980s and early 90s are warning enough. These counter-revolutions are the main reason that comrades in China have put up with me for more than 2 decades and have generally been responsive to my proposal. And that's because long before the fall of the Soviet Union, I had been studying the counter-revolutionary developments in Hungary, 1956, Czechoslovakia, 68, Poland, 1980. In Poland, the mass of workers turned against their own state. And while, say, Soviet interventions in Hungary and Czechoslovakia stopped counter-revolution, they did not solve the underlying problems. And counter-revolution comes marching back in. So a couple of vignettes from these decades of visits to China. In my second visit to China, the fall of 2000, my host took me to what I call the Great Anti-Wall. What was that? It was part of some 16,000 miles of tunnels dug in the 1930s and 1940s to defend against the Japanese Imperial Army, whose soldiers regularly dropped chemical weapons into the tunnels. So the army, with the help of peasants, began to dig a second level underneath the ground. And so the one that I visited had 2 levels, and the lower level could be sealed against chemical gases. The room on the second level was about the size of a large living room. And tellingly to me, it contained 2 pieces preserved from the 1930s, 2 pieces of simple but sophisticated machinery. One was used to produce uniforms for the Red Army, and the other ammunition. Now, only workers with experience in industry could have built and maintained those machines. His second consideration is that service in the army helped proletarianize the millions of peasants who served in the army. And that extended to work that the army undertook in industrial and agricultural production. So where I'm going with this is not only in theory, but in practice, the leadership of a proletariat in this extraordinary event of 1949. A second incident that is quite meaningful, I think, for today. About 15 years ago, my first host, who was one of China's top leaders, he was the Minister of Information in the Deng Xiaoping years, and the founder of what's now the Academy of Marxism. Well, he asked me, we were having a long meeting, and towards the end of the meeting, he asked me, what did I think of China's economic and military relationship with Russia, with the Russian Federation? And he may have been looking for approval, not sure, but so I said that the imperialist threats to China are very real, as they had been towards the Soviet Union, and that tactical alliances with states like Russia are justified for China. But at the same time, I said, there's no question that the Russian state emerged from counter-revolution, and that it's capitalist, and that its class interests and those of People's China are opposed. So it may not have been the answer my host was looking for, but before 7 in the morning the next day, the phone rings. I'm staying in a guest house of the Academy, and it was the interpreter at that meeting. And to get me a message before I left, Comrade Jin wants to let you know how much he appreciated your response on the China-Russian Federation relationship. Class comes first. So I'll never forget that. So some of the most class-conscious comrades I have met anywhere in the world are in the Chinese Party and products of education. Early in my visits, I began encouraging my hosts to do what they could to rebuild Marxism in theory and practice in the former Soviet republics and other states that felt the counter-revolution. I'm not sure if my suggestion played a role, but invitations to comrades from those states rapidly grew. And soon Russian was added to English for simultaneous interpretation at the meetings. In a meeting I participated in a few months ago, simultaneous interpretation in 7 languages, can you imagine? So, but now the simultaneous interpretation Russian was included because so many people were from former Soviet republics or fluent in Russian. Now, most contributions, particularly from the Communist Party of the Russian Federation, were essentially social democratic, nothing interesting about them. But 6 or 7 years ago, comrades from the YCL, Young Communist League of the Communist Party of the Russian Federation, gave 2 speeches that were electrifying. They had integrated Leninism. When I asked the next year what happened to them, I was told they had been expelled. But that told me that Leninism lives within the former Soviet Union. So, there are indications in Ukraine of remarkable opposition to the Ukrainian ruling class and its government, and its whipping up of the war. So that's significant. And there are indications of opposition within the Russian Federation coming from Marxists, of opposition to their ruling class and this ugly war. So I believe the weak link in the rusted world capitalist chain is Russia again. Russia and Ukraine, they share a great revolutionary tradition that includes Leninism, revolutionary defeatism, the defending the right of oppressed nations to self-determination, and the two associated land tasks. Land as territory if an oppressed nation chooses to separate, and tearing the land out of the hands of the landlords and finance capital behind them, what the Chinese party did incredibly well, and placing this land into the hands of those who will work and protect it. So, who are my hosts? They are part of a top layer of a Chinese party, not the absolute top, but at the top layer. And they represent the party work in what is an entwined party and government. I want to wrap up, and I'm going to skip this section. We can go back to it if there's interest, of differences between the Chinese Revolution and state that emerged from it compared to the Russian Revolution and the state that emerged from that. They're quite interesting, and it gives us an idea of how leaders as high as those who invited me could exist in a China. So, and let me just sum up now on terms of a material basis for revolutionary optimism. Can humanity escape the growing existential threats that capitalism and decay has served us? The threats include war, the economic and social disintegration. I can't tell you how affected I am by the disintegration of Syria. My name means from Aleppo in Arabic, and the disintegration of Lebanon, where we lived briefly, actually. But also breakdowns in biodiversity. The web of life could break down so that there's massive food crisis, as if the war hasn't created, the Ukraine war hasn't created one, and the rapid socially induced climate disruption. So happy we have someone from Alaska on this presentation, but I worry a lot about Alaska. The threats are immense. It's unavoidable now that humanity faces huge dislocations in coming decades in the hundreds of millions. But there's reason for cautious optimism. And let me explain. The world working class has developed sufficient strengths in philosophy, Marxism, in educational, cultural, and organizational methods, in actual organizations, unions, 5 states, which is down from 17 in the 1980s, but one is the dominant economy in the world, and above all, the communist parties. So as the introduction mentioned, there are 118 official communist parties in Solidnet, with a total membership of 110 million worldwide and some 420 million workers in affiliated labor unions. And that is enough to drown the bastards. The task now is to address those weaknesses that have led to so many grievous defeats. Second, world capitalism is immensely weakened and more disorganized internationally than it's been since the 1930s. In particular, the central disorganizer of the world, the US ruling class, is massively weakened. Internationally, it has lost China's productivity of labor, and overall vitalism it has completely overshadowed the United States. But also domestically, there's this unprecedented general rebellion of the social base of the ruling class that weakens it immensely. And then basically this ruling class has lost credibility domestically and internationally. Just too many lies, and that's crippling. But third is those existential threats to humanity can be very, very powerful forces favoring completion of the transition from capitalism to socialism. And the task of tasks is to unite the workers of the world. And one of the great lessons for me, and shortly after the Communist Party of China began to rejoin the World Communist Movement, not long after my first visit, initially sending observers, but joining fully a little more than a decade ago. But in any event, one of the leaders in China explained, workers of the world unite. First step is communist parties of the world unite. And then she learned English and came to Boston for one of the periodic US-China labor meetings we used to convene. And she added consciously, workers of the world unite. First step is communist parties of the world unite consciously. So thank you, and let's open it up.
Thank you very much, Wadi'h. Now, Gene, I believe you have some announcements to make.
Yes, you can hear me but not see me. Is that correct?
Oh, yeah, I will change that.
Well, that's okay. That's okay.
Yeah. Now you can start the video. Yeah.
Well, okay. That's not important, but we have some excellent programs coming up. Next week, we have a talk on the class struggle in contemporary India, and Raj has set that up. Raj, do you want to say,
Yes.
give the name of our speaker at least?
Yes, the speaker will be Vedabrata Payen. He's a filmmaker and a person of Marxist conviction. He lives in Los Angeles, and his talk would be centered on the mistakes the left has made in India in the recent farm movement, which opposed the neoliberal policies of Modi government. And he will also refer to the crisis for farmers in the United States. And so where he has filmed what is going on in the Midwest in the last few years, last few decades, in fact, but he went and recorded it. So it should be very interesting, and we're looking forward to that talk next week. Vedabrata Payen.
Okay, thank you, Raj. That will be excellent. And we also have following that on the 29th, we contacted our resident old Turk, Mehmet, who contacted a young Turk to give a talk on Turkey, NATO, Russia, and Ukraine under imperialism, and that's Barak Sayan. And that should also be good. Coming up on June 5th, Max Perry will speak again on Ukraine and what's going on with the left in the United States and elsewhere on Ukraine. Following that, June 22nd, economic impacts of sanctions on Russia. Jack Rasmus, who teaches at St. Mary's College over the hill in Orinda, will speak. And following that, June 19th, we'll have a speaker on Roe versus Wade. And that'll be Rosa Astra, the Party for Socialism and Liberation. So keep coming back. We'll have some good programs coming up, and we'll turn it over to Richard, I believe.
Thank you, Gene. I want to remind people and invite people who don't know that there are some expenses in putting on these programs. And so we're asking people to make contributions, financial contributions. The money goes to run our programs and also to help support the Niebel Proctor Marxist Library here in Oakland, California. I placed on the chat some information on how you can contribute. I especially urge people to make small recurring contributions. Once you set it up, you don't need to think about it anymore. So it's a very, very convenient. Modern technology makes that very painless to spend money. And in this case, it is to the workers' advantage. In any event, that information is also available on your email that announced the meeting, and it's also available on our website, ICSSmarx.org, where there is a donate button. So please consider that and give generously. Thank you.
Thank you, Eugene and Richard. So now we are going to go into the question and answers period. Again, let me remind that this is a comradely meeting, and we discuss it at a certain level. So I'm going to be looking at the hands raised, which you can do by reactions at the bottom of the Zoom screen. You can raise your hand there. And I'm going to give priority to people who have not spoken at all. And then in the second round, again, we are going to go with the hands up. And as you know, we usually give like 2 minutes to the person who's asking the question or making a comment, and then we give much more time to the speaker to respond. So I have a lot of hands there. So I'm going to start from the top with Raj, then I have Janet, Zachary, Jean, Richard, Yusuf, and Steve Zafler. So let's start with Raj, please. Raj, go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Mehmet, and thank you, Wadi'h, for your presentation. So I want to ask you some questions. And extreme poverty alleviation is an achievement, and I think has to be recognized. However, as my understanding of Marx is that it is not the removal of extreme poverty, rather that it is the power between capitalist class and the working class that is the contention. And if Chinese Communist Party represents the workers of China, then the question arises is, how is it that 280 million of those lowest, which I think by the definition of Marxism are proletarians, who come from villages and live in the cities without benefits and sleep in bunk beds to work in factories, long hours. Is this the class that actually Communist Party represents? And if it does, how is it that it allows a lot of capitalist class to enrich on the exploitation of labor 30 years after their reform? So I have difficulty grasping what you're saying about what the Chinese Communist Party represents in terms of which class it represents. I know it is different than here, so there's a big difference. I grant you that. So the other question associated with that is that not only is Chinese state now, Chinese capitalist class is investing and exploiting workers on a large scale inside China, but it's also exporting capital very significantly. So how does this do you justify under Marxism-Leninism? And third one is the Chinese state does not describe itself as a dictatorship of the proletariat, but rather a democratic dictatorship of proletariat and peasantry. That's how I understand. Correct me if I'm wrong. So by your definition, then again, it slides away from that. These are my three questions to you. Thank you.
Well, all very valid, and as I try to express, the changes could bring down the state. There's reason for cautious optimism, in part because the shock of the fall of the Soviet Union and 11 other states was a lesson that could not take things for granted. And let me see if I can backtrack. So, as we all know, Lenin proposed the new economic policy, which would involve very serious concessions to the capitalists, some of which the capitalists refused. For example, oil fields and refineries in Grozny and in Azerbaijan, and they refused them. Lenin was guaranteeing profits in the hundreds of percent. But there was a new economic policy, and interestingly, Deng Xiaoping and other soon-to-be leaders of the Communist Party in China were students in Moscow while the new economic policy was discussed and then briefly implemented. And it clearly had quite an impact on Deng Xiaoping. But it's taken me long enough. It should have been more obvious. The decisive factors in the fall of the Soviet Union and in so many other defeats are not to be found in the weaknesses in the Soviet Union, although they were there and definitely played a role, not to be found in, say, the weaknesses, say, in communist parties that should have led revolutions which were defeated. Iran, 1979, in my opinion, is one example. The decisive weaknesses, we make a mistake at looking at the Soviet Union, say, or the party in Iran in isolation. The decisive weaknesses were weaknesses in Marxism, in the world communist movement, and weaknesses in organization. Internal organization, but not least international organization. So, again, want to emphasize some of the strongest Marxists I've ever met are in China and in position of leadership. And the dangers are evident, and the leadership has posed and actually taken some steps to place limits on the power of the exploiters. However, and again, this is a huge problem. In China, I know where I was going with this. There was something so extraordinary about the Russian Revolution. In my opinion, the greatest step forward in the entire history of humanity, several 100,000 years, or that we could easily be blinded by this. And so, to take one major example, in 1924, a tremendous upsurge among workers. It actually started in 1918, impelled by the Russian Revolution among workers, And then in 1923 in China, also among peasants, tremendous struggle breaks out, 24, 25, 26, 27. And among the workers, they're challenging the power of the capitalists. And among the peasants, they're challenging the power of the landlords and the lenders behind them. And along come instructions through the Comintern, but really from the Soviet leadership, to follow the Kuomintang. And in 1927, effectively, that party and the working class suffered a terrible defeat. That defeat taught that party and its leaders to think some more. But nevertheless, how to organize the state and many other questions, they kept turning back to the Soviet Union. If you think that making a revolution is difficult, I sometimes joke that organizing the economy after a revolution makes organizing a revolution seem like a dinner party, preparing for a dinner party. It's that complex. And so the Chinese have followed the Soviet model. And where I'm going in particular is that party and government are entwined in China, as they were in the Soviet Union. Why is that important? So the government plays absolutely essential role in organizing defense, the army, against the exploiters, domestic and international, and in organizing the economy. And if you want to do that, you must involve the majority of the population, which is non-proletarian. Entwine party and the petty bourgeois classes, and we know which class will tend to dominate. This is why one of the repeated recommendations I have made, and maybe I'll get back to that, is for relative separation of the party and government. So the government should include representation by the non-proletarian masses, but the party, working very closely with the unions in particular, should be providing direction to the government. So the huge problem in China, in my opinion, and I've said that there, is, again, party and government are entwined, and the top leader is the head of a party, he's the head of government, he's the head of a military. And so for the 200th anniversary of Marx's birth in May 2018, I was there, President Xi gives quite a speech where he quotes the manifesto. But a few days later, he's meeting with the head Modi of India. And the implication of his speech would be his commitment to overthrow Modi. Well, that speech wasn't published for 6 months. And also within it, you look carefully, and there are abridgments in it of what Marx and Engels are calling for in the manifesto. So with the Soviet Union, can understand what happened and what set the stage for its fall. That Bolshevik party had 8,000 active members at the start of 1917, 8,000 members. By November, they're in power, and they don't have an army. They have no experience governing. And of course, the party is going to be swallowed by government, by other classes. And Lenin is struggling with this issue. But that's what happens, and you see a weakening on class questions. And you can also see how 1927 instructions come from the Soviet leadership for the great Communist Party of China not to follow through with the great struggles of the workers and the democratic tasks in the countryside, but to subordinate itself to the Kuomintang, and that influence is still there. Despite all of this, the Chinese party had more than 1 million members at the start of 1949, the year of the revolution, compared to 8,000 for the Bolsheviks. The civil war in China was fought before the victory of the revolution, so they had a hardened, proletarianized army. They had amazing experience in governing in liberated areas, experience in dealing with national questions, land questions, organizing economy. And Mao lives more than 25 years after the revolution. Compared to Lenin, barely having 6 years that were plagued, in part he was the target of assassination, and then he's ill. And so you have this problem of essentially the petty bourgeoisie dominating in an entwined party government. However, because of those differences in China, as far as I can see, the party in China dominates government. In the Soviet Union, government dominated the party. And that's then where my hosts come from. But all of us would be foolish to ignore the dangers that China faces. And I am concerned with this pandemic and the response to it, that explosions could develop. So let me give one more example. With the pandemic, there was quite an increase in unemployment among industrial workers. The government has responded by encouraging, sometimes with large sums, 85,000 bucks for the unemployed, for students graduating from college who are facing serious problems finding jobs. What's the government doing? They're encouraging industrial workers, students to open their own businesses. So when I was last in China, just as the pandemic was breaking out, end of December of 2019, I asked my interpreter, how many businesses are there in China? It was 113 million. The most recent figure I've seen is 125 million, largely small and startups. But again, Raj, it'd be an error to mistake danger with a change in the class character of the state. And believe me, I was acutely conscious of the dangers to the Soviet Union, because the Soviet leadership had supported creation of the Israeli state. And we can again go through how they could do that, just in total opposition to the position of Lenin in his famous letter to American workers in the summer of 1918, and the position adamantly held by the Comintern until it was dissolved against formation of an Israeli state. Well, the evidence is in 1945, essentially, the Soviet leaders secretly agreed with the United States, announced it in 1947, to support creation of the Israeli state. And the story gets worse from there. The Zionist forces, by and large, were not armed and not trained. And the Soviets arranged to arm them, provide them with airplanes and training. So you can see, why, so even though as I was studying Hungary 56 or Czechoslovakia 68, effectively by staying out of a communist party until shortly after the Soviet Union fell, essentially could have no influence that way. So, but yes, let's not, mix up the real danger with the done deal. The real danger did come in the Soviet Union, 1991. If China falls to counter-revolution, there's reason for cautious optimism, in my opinion, on China. But I think if China falls to counter-revolution, I don't think humanity can recover from the social, economic, and environmental threats. I think we'll go into a downward spin, as we've seen, say, in the Congo. Since 1991, maybe 10% of the population has died in the Congo as a result of conflict, mainly hunger, but wars. The disintegration in Syria, disintegration in Libya, where my sister used to live, disintegration in Lebanon, disintegration in Yemen. But South Asia, quite a problem. So I guess a response to what you're saying is just like, say, with some awful unions. Actually, the Teamsters are pretty bad, but not that awful. But they have businesses. They run businesses. They do some awful things to the rank and file workers. But our response is not to predict or write them off as capitalists or to predict their collapse, but to do what we can to strengthen them. And that's basically what I've tried to do in China. And I've raised very difficult things. It's involved correction. For example, their false stance, calling the Soviet Union imperialist. They've told me about their errors in Africa, quite serious. It goes on. So the working class can face the truth and correct its errors. So that's really my emphasis, is we want to strengthen the working class internationally and its power in states like China.
Thank you very much, Wadi'h. Before we continue, Wadi'h, is it possible to again rearrange the camera so that it shows you in full? We are seeing the map much more than we are seeing you. So maybe to the other side, if you can, please.
Oh, yes, sorry about that. I've lost myself. Am I still in existence?
You are in existence, but if you can just adjust the camera to your, like, towards the Paul Robson poster, it would help us see you better.
Is that better?
Yes, better than the other one. Yes. So now we are going to Janet. Janet Cobram, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. So Wadi'h, thank you very much. And given your background and speaking of Israel, I'm wondering, and this might be the subject of a different program, but maybe you could talk a little bit about the class nature of the Palestinian struggle. I mean, I understand there is an Israeli Communist Party, which I would personally have issues with. I'm sure there's plenty of contradictions. And Palestinians, I don't know whether the PLO would be their communist party, or anyway, if you would just talk a little bit about the class nature of the Palestinian struggle. Thank you.
This takes us back to the main topic, in a sense, the weaknesses and errors of the states like the Soviet Union that the Chinese state has very much been involved with. Imagine the rush to recognize Pinochet and welcoming him, or support to counter-revolutionary groups across Africa in reaction. So it wasn't the same with Palestine, but let me put it this way. The implication of the Soviet leaders supporting creation of an Israeli state. Backtrack. The crimes against Jews and Romas in Europe, and probably other nationalities like that, or groups. Maybe nationality was too strong for Jews before the atrocities there. But the implications of the atrocities was it now provided material justification for creating a refuge for Jews and Romas in Europe, not Palestine. So it's an old imperialist project, initially of Britain, thinking that Palestine was the center of world resources, but also because so many Jews were involved in revolutionary struggles, beginning with Marx. But the imperialists' initial support for creating an Israeli state was one, oil, which had proved so important in war, but also to divert Jews from communism to becoming national oppressors. And then to have the Soviet leadership and most CPs, some with resistance, supporting creation of an Israeli state, meant first that communists were supporting national oppression instead of national liberation. I mean, Woodrow Wilson, afraid from the Russian Revolution, had sent the commission, King Crane, to study Palestine, and King and Crane came back and said creating an Israeli state would be national oppression of Palestinians. And Woodrow Wilson said yes, and went on to support Britain taking over Palestine. But the implication for communists to support creation was first that communists were violating the right of an oppressed nation to self-determination. And second, it meant that communists were supporting taking land from the tiller. In other words, seizing, tearing the sickle from the hammer, and as a result, breaking the hammer. And so it's been devastating to CPs, not just in the Middle East, but across Africa and beyond. And I would include South Africa in this. National questions and land are not minor. We have to carry them out, and that was one of the great achievements of the Chinese Revolution in those 20 years before 49. So in any case, so my childhood hero was no sports star. It was Gamal Abdel Nasser, a pan-Arab nationalist, living in Egypt by then. And that's because he seemed to have taken on British, French, and Israeli armies and won in the 56 Suez War, meaning at least to have repelled them. And then along comes the 67 war. And it turns out that even Gamal Abdel Nasser could not organize a victory under conditions where it should have. And what happens then is a tremendous move among Palestinians, myself included, basically from pan-Arab nationalism to the working class, to Marxism, incorporating national questions. But Marxism is another story. So this is after the 67 war. By 1970, the working class, still immature, not well organized, but is in a position to contend for power in Jordan. And that was drowned in blood, Black September, with essentially all of the bourgeois regimes collaborating. If they weren't quick to collaborate, they were overthrown, like in Syria, and collaborating with this. The working class leadership was able to escape much of it, the bloodbath, and to move to Lebanon. And what follows is one of the great unknown developments in the world working class history, which is the working class rose to a position of power in Lebanon. The civil war broke out in 1975, April 1975, and by January of 1976, the working class is in a position of power, and the Palestinian bourgeoisie, PLO, at the request of the United States, working with the Syrian army, sent in the Palestine Liberation Army to put down the working class. And of course, the masses are confused. Palestine Liberation Army should be on our side, but geez, that's not how it appears. And the working class forces led by Palestinians essentially arranged to break up the Palestine Liberation Army the way they had broken up the Lebanese army along class lines. And by late April, May 1976, not only the Lebanese state, but the Lebanese fascists, armed and trained, open admirers of Hitler's, armed and trained by the Israelis at US direction, also defeated. And so there's no armed power standing in the way of a working class taking power in Lebanon. And the leadership, this is being the Middle East, oil, asked the Soviet leadership to defend it. And the response was, after some hesitation, wasn't immediate, was no. And then imperialism arranges. The Israelis want to pounce in. They told the United States said, "Don't you dare," and arranges for the Syrian army to come in over the mountains. I'll never forget this. First time I thought the Soviet Union could fall, to put down the working class. And since then, basically, reaction has dominated. So the working class forces have not been significant. There was this thrilling period, roughly from 1968, 69 to 1976, where Palestinians overwhelmingly spoke the language of Marxism. But after that defeat of revolution in Lebanon in May 76, with the Syrians rolled in on Soviet tanks. They'd been armed and trained by the Soviets, by the bourgeois army, social democratic. And what has followed since then is the rise of fundamentalism. And I've raised this in China, where, with Palestine to begin with, essentially the Chinese are very sensitive to questions of land reform. And I think there was quite a bit of opposition in the late 40s. To be sure, the Communist Party is in the middle of quite a civil war against communist support for creating the Israeli state. But that's long gone now. And at this point anyway, the corrections have to take place at the level of the world communist movement. It has not taken place yet.
Thank you very much. Now we are going to actually very, very interesting information there, especially in Lebanon. I'm not familiar with that and need to brush up on it. Very good information there. So now we are going to Zachary. Zachary, please go ahead. You have 2 minutes.
So I know we've discussed this privately, but I was wondering, China and Israel have very close economic, military, and technological relations and have had since the 90s. What would it take for the Chinese government to start making a split from their relations with Israel, and instead of just supporting a two-state solution, like really take a revolutionary stance on Palestine?
I think a lot of things will need to come together, not just on Palestine. And as I was trying to imply, basically the threats to humanity can be a powerful impulse to making a lot of corrections. And that includes with the Israeli state. To be sure, imperialism has made such a mess of this apartheid death trap. It's been a death trap not only for Palestinians, but it's set up as a death trap for Jews. I've joked that it will take half of China's population to try to figure out how to address this correctly, the way that they address with such sensitivity national and ethnic questions in China in the 40s. There were plenty of them. I corrected myself later. I said, okay, half of a Chinese party, that would be 48 million people. But in any event, it is such a mess. And of course, there's well over 1 million, I call them whites, from the Soviet Union, before and after its fall, in the Israeli state, among the most ardent in calling for death to the Arabs and so on. Again, how to, you know, so, yeah, no, I mean, China's, we can understand why China could, you know, make arrangements with the Israeli state because imperialism denies it some technical aid. But as Lenin said, they'll sell us the rope with which to hang them. And the Israelis have been doing that. But again, they're exceedingly sensitive to this question of national oppression from the 40s. This is a problem now. And to the question of land to the tiller. And but I guess the way I would place it is, for all communist parties, the reference point is the Russian Revolution, not the weaknesses, not errors like on Palestine. It's the Russian Revolution, taking the interests of the working class to conclusion: seizure of power, national liberation, land reform. And again, reason for cautious optimism: things could go terribly wrong very quickly. And again, I'm very worried about the pandemic.
Thank you. Now we are going to Jean. Jean, go ahead, please.
Okay, I'm on, yes. Okay, well, thank you so much. And again, it's true that just because we're revolutionaries doesn't mean we don't make mistakes. So, and we have a whole slew of them we could discuss. But I want to get back to the overthrow of the Soviet Union, because nobody really saw that coming. And I remember the events leading up to it and the disastrous results. And the fact that many people I admired greatly on the left were now saying, well, it's all over, you know, Marxism, we have to give up on Marxism. And I'd spent a long time studying Marxism and was not about to give it up. So my reaction was that Marx was right in the 19th century, Lenin was right in the 20th century, and that our task in the 21st century is to do for Leninism what Lenin did for Marxism. And I approach this, of course, as an academic in an academic way. But it seems to me like what I was approaching in an academic way, the Chinese Communist Party, the Communist Party of China, rather, approached this, actually did it in a practical way. They worked out the solution. So that China's approach to world revolution is a step forward, in a sense, on Leninism. And I think one could see this in the way what's going on now. You know, we all love Che Guevara and his resistance, but we have to remember that the imperialists caught him and killed him, murdered him, and that didn't work. China is opening relations with Nicaragua in spite of all this nonsense about the Monroe Doctrine, and is planning to do practical things, such as build a canal through Nicaragua, which I'm not sure is a good idea, but it's not under the control of the United States. So China offers a new approach, I think, to the problem we all face as revolutionaries. And I look at it as a learning process. I want to find out what they're doing and how it's going to work, and basically give them what little support I can. So I just wanted to say that and see what your reaction is, Wadi'h, because I always respect your opinion so much on these matters. Thank you.
The first thing is, Jean, thank you, Jean. Jean identifies as an academic, but he comes from a working class family, steel workers. He worked working class jobs. He worked, he joined the Marines. If anything is proletarianizing.
Not the brightest thing I ever did.
And nevertheless, very significant to me. And then you have speeches like, definitely not a concession speech. And that's a working class person who deeply integrated Marxism. so very, to me, very significant. I have to tell you, when the Soviet leaders turned their back on done deal revolution in Lebanon in 1976, May 1976, that's the first time I thought the Soviet Union could fall. By the way, the only serious recognition I've seen that the working class was in a position to rise to power was from the Hoover Institute's yearbook on the International Communist Movement, reviewing events of 1976. That's the clearest and only class-conscious description I've seen of that extraordinary events in Lebanon in that year. In any case, the thought of the Soviet Union falling, 1976, was so horrible, I set it aside. However, 4 years later, we have the rise of Solidarność, Polish workers against their state, 1980. And my description then is humanity is in this terrible backward race, which will collapse first. The capitalism economically, major crisis, or the Soviet Union. And then I realized the two are connected. The capitalist crisis was placing tremendous pressures, economic, military, political value on the Soviet Union. And the internal weaknesses that our world movement failed to correct left it vulnerable to those pressures. And so again, we're living in a single world economy with two social systems interacting and conflicting. The only source of any stability in the world economy, that's really what got me invited to China to begin with, has been the states created by socialist revolution. Raj, this is important, only secondary to what class took power in 1949. But you look at the Soviet Union, for decades, they don't have economic cycles. Even in the 1980s, they grew at 3% a year. China has gone for decades. By contrast, I think the Japanese miracle broke the all-time record, how many consecutive months of GDP increase, and it's hardly the same as economy, without a downturn, and that was 56 months. Again, China's gone decades. So that's again indicative that this is a different social system in China because the state control over the economy, even with capitalists there, they control the army, allows allocation and reallocation of the surplus to overcome the imbalances, disproportionalities that lead to general capitalist crisis. But they're part of a single world economy like the Soviet Union. And the tremendous growth in crisis in the world, not the United States at the time, but throughout the capitalist world, beginning about 1973, but escalating in the 1980s, just put this tremendous stress on the Soviet Union and not prepared for it. And I keep warning in China, and it was the title of one of my presentations, I think for the Marx 200th anniversary, 3 typhoons are about to hit China. Typhoon from economic crisis of capitalism, a typhoon from war threats, and typhoon from environment. And they keep reinviting me. But again, what we do, including here, can make a real difference. And the key organizations is the Communist Party here, because it's part of Solidnet. It's one of those 118 parties. So, and again, it's a two-way interaction. And I can understand why people get disgusted or with the errors and weaknesses, including on Palestine, many others. But nevertheless, the key, it's extraordinary considering the Soviet Union fell, that the Solidnet would have 118 million members. And by the way, that Chinese party is, I've never seen a party organized like it. It's hard work to be in the CP in China. So and as far as I can see, it's much better organized. It's than, say, the party in Vietnam, which is well organized, or the party in Cuba. That Chinese party, 95 million members, absolutely extraordinary in organization. And so if anybody can play a huge role in helping humanity organize the way out and through the transition, above all, it's a Chinese party.
Yeah, thank you very much. Now we are going to Richard Fallenbaum.
Yes, thank you very much, Wadi'h. Good to see you again, and your insights. I have to take exception to one element, important element of your presentation. I don't agree that the alliance between China and Russia is a kind of alliance of convenience. I don't think the Chinese and the Russians describe it that way, and they describe it in very important terms. They describe it as an alliance that is beyond any alliance that the two countries have ever had before, even during Soviet times. So, and I think this era, and many on the left and many in the Communist Party, including the Communist Party of the United States, and then many of our members in ICSS, is to view Russia as an imperialist power, and I think it's inconceivable that China would have that kind of relationship with another imperialist power, and it means that they mistake the war in Ukraine as an imperialist war. I think I think the Marxist attitude, in my view, is that war is a class war between the forces of the proletariat and the forces of capital, in which Russia is taking the lead in the struggle against imperialism, U.S. imperialism, and it's quite open about it. That they say that their object is to destroy the power of U.S. imperialism and the imperialist bloc. And so I think it's fundamental for Marxists to express their solidarity with the efforts and the sacrifice of the Russian people in Ukraine. So, but otherwise, thank you for your presentation.
Would you like to respond, Wadi'h, or shall we go to
Yes.
the next question?
So first, let's keep in mind, again, the top leadership in China essentially is government leadership, mixing up classes. And that places certain pressures on them, and they also have to deal with world leaders like Modi. Not long after that Xi Jinping speech for Marx's 200th anniversary, and the speech was effectively suppressed for about, maybe 5 or 6 months. So Modi was long gone by then. But the implication of that speech was, we want to overthrow Modi. And I think that would apply to Nehru as well, who murdered quite a few communists and on. But again, my host is one of the most influential. He's still alive. The state is publishing his collected works. I have a couple volumes. When he calls me before 7 in the morning to say how much he appreciated what I had to say, class comes first. So recognition that the Russian Federation is a state created by counter-revolution. It's not even a state that evolved under capitalism for decades or centuries. This is new, although too long has passed, 30 years. And what I was saying is the interests of the state are of the capitalist state, and those of the state like China, created by worker-led revolution, are opposed. You can make tactical arrangements, but we have to speak the truth. And again, the model for me, if you haven't read it, Lenin's letter to American workers, which mentions Palestine twice, 2 warnings, I think, about essentially balancing the task of communists with the task of protecting and developing the young Soviet state. We're talking 1918. So something huge is that because of Solidnet, and because actually of comrades in China who are providing me with some information, but in any case, there are 2 communist parties in Solidnet from Russia, from the Russian Federation, the KPRF and RKWP, Russian Communist Workers' Party. Initially, the Russian Communist Workers' Party took a reasonable position against the war. They appear to have caved in, however, supporting the war. That has led to, it appears, a significant split. And I am fairly sure that those youth from that I met in Beijing 7 or 8 years ago had moved to the Communist Workers' Party. And they're doing as Lenin, taught us to do in war, which is we're fighting for peace, but that means the necessity to oppose our own bourgeoisie. And they're meeting with ferocious resistance, ferocious oppression. And the Communist Party in Ukraine, which has been suffering severe repression, also has taken a good position against their own ruling class and its army, a position of defeatism, as in Lenin, revolutionary defeatism. And this is exceedingly significant. And the road to peace. This war could easily, we all know, spin out of control. Imperialism is on a war path born out of crisis and weakness, but that's what makes it so dangerous. But if so, we're foolish to ignore the dangers, but even more foolish to ignore the weakness of the system. And they're fueling the fire of this war. They're leaving the Russian Federation no way out but to fight and fight some more, and destroying the Ukrainian economy, and doing a job in terms of poverty and hunger around the world. And no, they are aware of this. Biden has said it many times. This will result in higher food prices. This will result in higher energy prices. And so again, we can present the way to peace. And Lenin, I really recommend Lenin's Socialism and War from 1915. So he touches on the utmost immunity of the workers of the world. We have the makings of it, but it's far from being the utmost. Second, revolutionary defeatism for communists in warring countries. And the third, was the importance of the struggle for the right of oppressed nations within Russia, in Lenin's case, to self-determination. And he hadn't been clear yet in 1915 about the importance of land, but he sure was by 1917, and adds the land question, which is huge for national liberation and for socialist revolution. So, so again, in part because I have access through the Communist parties I'm aware of this Communist Party in Ukraine. And surely you've seen, those Kononovich brothers who got arrested and face death sentences. The Ukrainian party put out a great statement on Solidnet shortly before the war, calling for international unity and opposition to the war. And things are stirring within the communist movement in the Russian Federation. And that's the road to peace. Or put it this way, the summary, the Leninist road to peace is through prosecution of a class struggle. We have to tie up these warmongers. And believe me, this Putin is a warmonger, nothing compared to the United States, US imperialism, or the NATO countries. But he's a warmonger. And I'll never forgive him for the war he conducted against the Chechen people, which, by the way, came home to Boston. Those two young people who, foolishly bombed at the Boston Marathon, they were Chechens. And one of them was killed, and the Supreme Court a couple months ago declared the other should face a death sentence. He was 18 maybe at the time. His older brother was 26 maybe. There are plenty of national questions within the Russian Federation. There are fewer within Ukraine, but we need to pay attention to them. And again, this is a huge role that the Communist Party of China can do in terms of fine-tuning national questions, ethnic minority questions, land questions. But they're not there now. And, but yes, my host said, class comes first.
Thank you. Yusuf, now it's your turn.
Okay, maybe I'll be later on, we could discuss Lebanon. I think there needs to be some fine tuning of the statements, because I think you telescoped two events, 1976 and later 78 or something, where the attack on Tripoli and Tel Zatar.
No.
Well, okay, but anyway, elaborate on you mentioned the dispute with Yugoslavia just after the war. I think Yugoslavia correctly supported the revolution in Greece, whereas Russia, Soviet Union did not give military aid to them. Also, I think I mentioned this before. The Vietnamese comrades, when they came to our conventions, explained, well, what we have right now is not socialism, but we are dedicated to building socialism in the long term. We have to right now increase production, but later on there will be an orderly transition to socialism. I think that's their position. The Chinese formulation is that this is socialism with Chinese characteristics. Now, of course, the road to socialism has taken into account the local realities. That's obvious, but in and of itself, I think it's ambiguous and has, I think it's not helpful. And I think the Vietnam formulation of Vietnam, I think, is much clearer. And I would like if you have any comments on that.
Oh, I agree with the Vietnamese in terms of greater clarity. Um, um, so I think I asked early on, is China socialist? Is China capitalist? Is China socialist? If not, what is it? And the answer is, it's a state created by a working class led revolution. And from Marx, we understand what this should be is the dictatorship of the proletariat. And confuse that, mix that up. So the Soviet leadership declared the Soviet Union socialist and then fully communist sometime in the 1930s, and then realized, wait a second, you know, and backtracked on that. But what was that doing is it hides the fact that the working class should rule. To be sure, it can be liberating for those with their own businesses who often work 7 days a week and whose lives are insecure, and also allows, say, for the workers to make sacrifices if they understand that making this sacrifice will help build the state. And Lenin talked about that when the NEP was being introduced in Russia. But no, there's something lovely about something very good about Vietnam. They take a lot of time. I've been there. They take a lot of time studying China, the approaches they've taken, learning from them, and trying to apply them as best they can. The unions are historically been more effective in defending workers than the Chinese unions have been since opening up and the market changes. Again, want to emphasize the scientific Marxist term for what China should be, what the Soviet Union should have been, is dictatorship of a proletariat, which required that the party be a party only of the working class and representing the interests of the working class, working very closely with the unions. Mix up the other classes and you have a prescription for 1 million incorrect decisions that weaken the building. And then one day the storm comes along and the building comes down, like that Soviet building, or like that building on the beach in Florida a year ago or so. 1 million false decisions and the building is compromised. And it is astonishing. So quickly, Tel Zatar, I was there. It's a Palestinian refugee camp. I was there, and the Syrian army, when it entered on the Soviet tanks at the end of May 1976, starved several thousand Palestinians to death. I went crazy. That they just would not allow anything to go in or out. And the condition of Palestinians in Lebanon since the defeat of what should have been a revolution has just been miserable. As terrific as the fight by Hezbollah, especially in the decade, they learned some of the best practices, nevertheless, not internationalist. So no, but that started end of May 1976, the siege of Tel Zatar, and some of the information I have came from people I knew there, but much of it came. The Washington Post reporter was quite good in terms of giving details, including the United States telling the Israelis, "Don't you dare move," and calling first the Palestine Liberation Army, and then in particular in May '76, the Syrian army. So, incidentally, the Israeli invasion of 1982 with the murders of Sabra and Shatila, the Syrian army didn't do a thorough job of just destroying the working class. And Sabra and Shatila were Palestinian refugee camps towards the airport where there was a resurgence of the working class. And so the Israelis arranged for what had been the Phalange, now retitled South Lebanon Army, to carry out the massacres as they guarded the gates. But the idea was to suppress the working class.
Yeah, thank you, Wadi. I think next is Steve Zatzer. Go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, it's clear that the United States wants to surround Russia and China. So there is a active effort to do that militarily. But the question for the working class is, what is the working class going to do to defend itself? And I think it's
I'm sorry, what the working class
is going to do about imperialist inter-imperialist war. The question is, what is the working class going to do about imperialist war, inter-imperialist rivalry, which is the solution. I mean, war is the solution that capitalism has to its economic crisis. But what I want to talk about, I mean, is that there is a rise of fascism internationally. I don't think that the Chinese bureaucracy is, relies on peaceful coexistence and support for bourgeois relationships with capitalist governments. But the one question that has been left out of this discussion is the role of export of capital by China into Africa, Latin America, and other countries, particularly the privatization of ports around the world. China has been engaged in buying ports, including in Piraeus in Greece, and then engaging in a massive union busting campaign to destroy the unions. And there have been strikes there. And the same is true in many other countries. And right now, I put it up, there's a struggle of the Namibian workers, where China has bought the entire uranium mine section in Namibia and is engaged in a major union busting campaign, Chinese National Nuclear Corporation, to destroy the unions. They fired the union leadership at the Rosine plant, and they also fired a new president who was elected. So I don't think that that has anything to do with socialism. I don't think it has anything to do with the defending the working class internationally. And, there's a saying in Namibia, there's socialism with Namibian characteristics. SWAPO, which has made these deals, not just with China, but European capitalist countries to take over the fishing industry, to basically they're selling out the whole country, says that they're developing socialism in Namibia. It's far from it. And the lessons of that is that, in fact, the international policy, labor policy of China is for basically destroying independent unions, worker unions, and setting up a labor management, a management situation where the workers have no independence. So that has nothing to do with internationalism, working class power, and defending workers around the world. I don't know of any statement they've made of supporting workers' struggles in the United States against the capitalists, because they themselves have investments in the United States in corporations which are anti-union. So this idea that the Chinese bureaucracy is playing a progressive role vis-a-vis the working class of the world, I don't think is based on any real factual information about what's going on. And last, China is sending workers to Israel to support the infrastructure projects of Israel. The Chinese Communist Party, as I pointed out, supports a two-state solution, like the South African Communist Party, and they don't support a one-state solution and a secular state. So again, I would say that they're involved in the exploitation of Palestinian workers when they export Chinese workers to do construction workers in Israel.
Mm.
Thank you, Steve. Wadi, do you want to respond before we go to the next question?
So an approach, and this will also give you an idea of the approach when I was asked about the response to the pandemic. So an approach, say, with opening, or purchasing, be it a copper mine or uranium mine in Africa, or a port, is the government, whose legitimate job is to develop the economy, should make an argument, it really would be very helpful if we had secure access to copper, say, or uranium. The unions in China should weigh in evaluating that from the point of view of essentially the interests of the working class in China and let's say in Namibia. The Communist Party's job is to weigh the overall interests of the working class, which includes protection of the Chinese state, one of the great achievements of humanity. But the Communist Party's job is to represent the interests of the working class, regardless of nationality. I'm quoting from the manifesto. And so you see basically that problem of that entwining of party and government and subordination of unions within China, and often, but not always, not paying attention to interests of workers, be it in the United States or in Africa. Often the corporations, Chinese corporations involved, by the way, are privately owned. But nevertheless, Chinese state had better pay attention to what we would associate with China. And in Cuba, I've met with real anger at China because the corporations demand commercial terms that often Cuba hasn't been able to meet, especially with prices in recent years. And so instead of developing unity between, you know, a remarkable state of a working class Cuba and an equally remarkable, but forget 123 times larger accomplishment of the working class, the Chinese state, not to pay attention to the interests of the working class can cause real problem. But again, keep in mind the true interests of the Chinese state, as of a Communist Party, their real interests are not to violate interests of the working class anywhere in the world, but to advance the transition. And so yes, now there's reason for concern. So let me go back to the question of the pandemic. They asked me a few months into the pandemic, what do you think? I said, well, I thought when things first broke out in Wuhan that it was justified to take such severe measures, which was really to lock down first the city and then the province. The city alone is, I've been there, 13 million, 12 million. And until you can understand what the disease does, how it's communicated, and so on. But then to develop policies for the pandemic as a whole, my recommendation was that the unions have separate committees and hire their own public health experts to weigh in that the party, separate from government, does the same on the international scale. For example, helping workers around the world around occupational safety and health measures around the pandemic. But then the women's organizations, the various equality organizations, the youth organizations, nutritionists, MDs, nurses, each with their own committees, and basically each bringing in presentation proposals for for policy, and then working out the policy and assessing it and changing it as things change. And certainly this Omicron has changed things. So again, it gives you an idea of what I'm proposing. And one of China's top leaders told me about 3 or 4 years ago, we're trying to separate party and government, but it's proven very difficult. So he went out of his way to say this to me, maybe a year and a half after I had last raised it with him. And then he went on, one thing we're doing now is experimenting with that separation at local levels. And that's, again, one of the wonderful things in the history of the Chinese party is they experiment with policies, with certain measures, within certain limitations, and learn from best practices. And they are unbelievable. When, a task comes up, they'll recruit sometimes 1,000 specialists to study a task, and from every possible angle. And they go out in the field. I've been with them and ask questions. And the result may be that they do 2 or 3 experiments around something, around a policy. But that hasn't been the case with the pandemic. And again, very problematic in terms of these various plants that they've been buying. And so.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. We are coming towards the end of our recorded session, which we will turn off. But we have Michael Karsh, who has not spoken yet. So after that, we're going to turn off and then go into, unofficial, unrecorded session till 1 o'clock. So go ahead, Michael, please.
Okay, I heard you talking about China building a canal in Nicaragua. How practical is that? I thought aren't there mountains in Nicaragua that would make that difficult? And besides that, another thing I heard is that going from Nicaraguans, I thought, rely on Lake Nicaragua for fresh water. So if they build a canal from the Caribbean to Lake Nicaragua into the Pacific, that would introduce salt water into that. Wouldn't that be bad?
Yeah. Again, our opposition can make a difference, especially within the communist parties. But there's also an effort to instead build a railroad and modern facilities, and that would not have the environmental impact. And better yet, to reduce this crazy consumption and to find ways of producing much more at home, and above all, to complete the transition, then some problems that seem insoluble today can prove to be very, very soluble.
With that, then, I think we've come to the end of our Q&A that is recorded. Raj,
Should
if you
I
could
turn off
please.
the recording?
Yes, please, if you could.
Institute for the Critical Study of Society at the Nebel Proctor Marxist Library receives no corporate funding, nor do we have any paid staff. We rely on the support of working class folks that share our commitment to the socialist legacy of Karl Marx. We continue to need funds to meet necessary expenses. Since we can no longer pass the hat at our in-person forums, please send contributions to our treasurer, either online via PayPal or by check. The PayPal ID is ICSS Sunday, SUNDAY, @yahoo.com, and the name is Richard Fallenbaum. And checks may be made out to Richard Fallenbaum and sent to him at 1225 Nielsen Street, Berkeley, California, 94706. Fallenbaum is spelled Fallenbaum. To donate directly to the Marxist Library, send a check to the Nebel Proctor Marxist Library at 6501 Telegraph Avenue, Oakland, California, 94609, or directly or donate online at www.paypal.me/npml. For information, write to npml at marxistlibr.org, and the website is marxistlibr.org.